Hello and welcome back to the channel. This is the 1000 subscriber Q&A special. So quite a while back, I gave you guys the opportunity to ask me questions. I posted up on Instagram. And so now I have 27 questions to answer. So let's get right into it. So the first one is, do you think a barbell velocity tracker is a good tool for those who have trouble with RPE? In short, do I think it's a good tool? Yeah, I think it is a good tool. But is that necessarily the first thing that I would do if you are someone who struggles with RPE? You know, when you say trouble with RPE, I'm also assuming you mean either rating the RPE of the set that you just done or selecting the load to try and hit a certain RPE. Now, I'm going to tackle this in two ways. So the first one, if you are having trouble with selecting a load for a set and an RPE, then what I would do is, if you have a coach, then always engage with your coach to try and figure out what the RPE is. If you don't have a coach, you can always speak to other powerlifters who are slightly more experienced than you, and that can be, they can sometimes be a good, assuming that they are mature, they can be a good way to sort of figure out what your RPE might be. If you're someone who either always overshoots or always undershoots, or they're a little bit inconsistent, you have to ask yourself, what's the process that you are using to deciding what weight you are going to do for that set? And I would focus on this process leading up to this first. If you're someone who always overshoots, right? If you think about the decision leading up to that, are you actually deciding the weight that you want to hit from way before the session? Because if you are doing that, then stop doing that, right? The only time that you are supposed to decide what weight you should hit for a certain RPE should be your last warm-up set. If you are someone who makes the decision after the last warm-up set, what you need to do is then calibrate your decision-making after every time you make a mistake. So let's say you need to hit an RP8 single and your last warm-up is RP6. You work up to your last warm-up set and, assuming that your last warm-up was, let's say, RP6, and you decided to add a certain number of kilos to hit RP8. Let's say you end up overshooting, right? Let's say you added 10 kilos and you end up overshooting. Then what you need to do next time is, every time you go to that same last warm-up again and it felt like RP6, you need to readjust how many kilos you add on. So rather than thinking an extra 10 kilos would be RP8, maybe instead add 5 or 7.5. So what I'm saying is you need to revise your decision making when it comes to going from your last warm-up set to your first working set or your top set. That's part of, if you are someone who has trouble hitting, trouble with RPE or selecting loads for a certain RPE. If you are having trouble rating your RPE and you're never quite sure what it is, right? You're never sure if it's a 6, a 6.5 or a 7. Like I said before, maybe ask one or two people just to get a feel for what the consensus is, because, there is such a thing as wisdom of the crowds, right? And so that can be a source. Obviously, if you have a coach, obviously ask your coach. But in terms of being extremely accurate with your RPE, you don't necessarily need to be that accurate or that precise with rating your RPEs, because the thing that matters slightly more is being consistent with how you rate your RPEs, right? If it is like an RP 9.5 and then you rate it as a 6, then yeah, you need to just sort of be a bit more grounded in rating your RPEs. But let's say it's plus or minus 1 RP and you're not sure. Yeah, what matters more is that you're more consistent with rating it, because what happens is, one of the reasons why rating your RPEs is important is because then you can project your top end performance, your estimated 1 max for that session. And that's important because you want to track the general trend of your performance from week to week. And that matters more than knowing exactly where your RPE is or your estimated 1 max is. Don't worry too much about it being super accurate, because I know velocity trackers can be extremely expensive. I would focus on doing those things first, making sure that you got those basics right, having a better process of working up to an RPE or just being a bit more consistent with rating your RPE. If you are a novice lifter, or, if you've not been in the game for that long, a barbell velocity tracker probably wouldn't be the first thing that I would go to. I would just focus on being a bit more experienced. But if you are more experienced, you probably wouldn't be necessarily be asking this question anyways, but if you are experienced and, you are lifting at a high level and you're doing all the right things, but if you are an experienced lifter and you are competitive, then a barbell velocity tracker may be a useful addition to your toolkit, right? So for helping you with RPEs. But at the end of the day, I would focus on gaining, if you are a newer lifter or a younger lifter or a less experienced lifter, focus on doing all the other things of being a bit more experienced with it, having a better judgment, having a much better process of rating your RPEs and selecting loads for your RPEs first, right? The next question is it harder to make gains when you're approaching 40? Yeah, of course, in the sense that, like, if you were to compare yourself to a younger person, of course, like, when you get to your, 30s, physiologically speaking, when that aging process starts to really kick in, your rate of progress obviously can be reduced, especially if you're asking this position from the place of being a very, very experienced lifter, then you're probably going to focus a bit more on defending your strength. But having said that, I have seen, very experienced lifters still continue to make small gains over time, like really marginal gains. It does happen, right? But by the time you're 40, your life might not necessarily be optimized for powerlifting. You got to take that into consideration as well. But if you are new to lifting, or if you're new to powerlifting, you can definitely still make substantial gains. They obviously wouldn't be as much as if you were to compare yourself to a 20-year-old, but I wouldn't necessarily let that stop you. So that's what I would say. How long is the average lifter's career? How ambitious should newer lifters be? I don't actually have any data on this at the time being. That actually might be a useful original research piece I might do for a YouTube video in the future. So I'll actually put that down. The thing is, we do, the people that we often do see are, if you're a keen powerlifter, you're a very proactive powerlifter, and you pay attention to the industry. I mean, you pay attention to the scene. You may find that, powerlifters have been around for a while, but the powerlifters that you probably don't see and you don't really notice are the ones that come into it and actually leave within a handful of years. They're and it's understandable, right? Because when you do powerlift and you get to a certain point, your rate of progress becomes so much more marginal, and there's a lot more effort that you have to put in to make very smaller rates of progress. Some people do get burnt out from it, right? Like, because if you compare powerlifting to many other sports, you can see why powerlifting can be a very repetitive sport. Sometimes people end up pushing very hard and end up getting injured, and that can retire people from the sport as well. How ambitious should newer lifters be? You can be as ambitious as you want, right? Like, let's say, current world champions probably once upon a time wanted to be really high level lifter in their career, right? Like, when they first started lifting. You can be as ambitious as you want to be. That, I absolutely have no problems with it. The thing that I would add to that is actually being extremely realistic with your expectations, right? And understand that powerlifting, the greatest success that a powerlifter will achieve will be that which is done over a long period of time, right? So I would just keep that in mind. And one of the things that I would look at, I'll take a really good recent example, right? So the 83 champion Durins from the UK, he's been lifting for quite a few years. He's been in the game for quite a while. And it took him quite a long time for him to become world champion, but you need to be able to survive the journey through all those years. And I think, if I remember correctly, his first international competition was in 2018. Obviously, there was COVID that sort of split that, create a gap for that career. But yeah, and he was lifting quite a bit before that as well. Powerlifting is definitely a marathon, as they say, rather than a sprint. So you can be as ambitious as you want, but just understand that it will be a very long game, unless you are a genetic freak, in which you will very quickly accelerate. So yeah. This question is, do you think the American approach to programming is effective for most lifters? I don't actually know what you mean by American approach to program, but when you say the phrase X approach to programming, I interpret that as a particular way or approach to designing programs, right? I think most approaches can be suitable for most people, but a certain approach just by definition means an approach to programming with certain constraints, right? That's what I interpret as a certain approach. If you have constraints, you are eliminating the possibility of using other strategies. If those other certain strategies happen to be the solution for someone's problem, then having that particular approach to programming then is not going to work by definition. I hope that answers your question. How do you feel about the rise of non-IPF feds? Is it a good thing for the sport? How do I feel about the rise of non-IPF feds? In the context of individual lifters, it obviously gives lifters freedom, but then it's kind of like the case of there are so many federations. The tendency is to go towards, to the federations that either serve you well in your local area, because the truth is certain federations are just not present in certain geographical locations, right? And so sometimes you don't really have a choice. And that can actually be a good thing because it can be a entry into the sport where you eventually work your way towards an IPF federation. So, and also from with regards to freedom for the individual, it gives people freedom, but then again, you might have too much freedom, right? It's like going to the supermarket and seeing that there's 100 shampoos to choose from. I think with regards to the sport, I think it's a bad thing for the sport. And the reason why I say that is because powerlifting in different sports can be, because of the different types of rules that there are, because there's such a lack of uniformity, it's almost like there are those different federations are almost different sports to a certain extent. I think that generally speaking, the sport is better if it's all under one federation, but that's just my take on it. And I think, then we can have a much bigger talent pool across the whole sport. And I think that would be a better sight to see. Next question is, belt on a bench and using weightlifting shoes used to be very popular. What happened? I actually think that, so I'll answer this in two aspects. I think belt on a bench, I know there are some people who, very few individuals still use it and they benefit from it, which is fine. I think that it's actually, my belief is that it's a remnant from equipped powerlifting. And I think there were lots of things from equipped powerlifting that sort of just through tradition sort of carried its way into classic lifting. But then over time, people realized it wasn't that helpful and people stopped doing it. And weightlifting shoes for bench press is specific, from my experience, was generally used so that people can maximize how far back they can tuck their feet. And that's a more static approach to doing leg drive, right? And I think people started to understand muscle physiology a lot better. And when people started to understand the idea of the length tension relationship, so, the force capabilities of a muscle group, the amount of force that the quads, specifically the quads, can produce is strongest not when it's most stretched out, not when it's shortest, when your knees are extended, but somewhere in the middle. And so people started to realize that having slightly more vertical shins was I think a lot of lifters found it to be a superior way of performing leg drive, and that you were probably better off wearing flats if you did choose that position. When people used to want to tuck their feet all the way back where you relied on passive tension from the muscle belly, that's why people often opted for weightlifting shoes. That's my belief. Next question is, would you recommend a 30mm belt for squats and a 10mm belt for deadlift? Does it really matter? Would you recommend a 30mm belt for squats and a 10mm belt for deadlift? Does it really matter? The thing about a 13mm belt is that it's just harder to break into. That's like one of the key features of it. I honestly I'm not convinced that a 13mm belt would provide that much more support that a 10mm belt won't give you, so long as the belt buckle is stable and in working order. I would actually just focus on recommending a belt that you find comfortable wearing. That's sort of my recommendation. I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that you need a thicker belt for squats. I would just go for the one that you feel comfortable but sturdy at the same time. So yeah, no, I don't think it matters that much. What are the most frustrating things that clients can do? Probably like not paying on time. I think that can be a frustrating thing, but that's like more of a general client thing. In terms of like athlete things, I think, over the years, like when I was younger and I was less experienced, I was stereotypically that frustrated strength coach archetype, right? But over the years, you learn, when you start to take a bit more responsibility of the situation on things, you'll learn to figure out how you can impact the situation in a more constructive way. And so just generally speaking, I became less and less frustrated over time. But I do think, I think when athletes are dishonest about what's going on, that can be a quite frustrating thing, because they don't want to tell you something because they fear that you might adjust the program accordingly, and that might mean that they're going to get weaker because of it. I think that's probably the most frustrating thing. I think even I find that, when you explain something to athletes and they understand it, but they continue to repeat the same problems, that can be a bit frustrating. But the thing that I learned from that is to actually just to be a bit more patient as a coach and understand that, athletes are fallible and people are on their own journey of personal development. You can't really be that frustrating, but those are the sort of things that sort of frustrate me the most at the time being. But they don't, apart from that, they don't. Yeah, that's probably the thing that gets me the most. Or when people deliberately disobey your load caps, that can be extremely frustrating. Next one is, can you excel in both weightlifting and powerlifting simultaneously? I think you can. This is the thing, right? Like, you need to have the capacity to be able to train for both. And yes, you can obviously get better at both. The answer is yes, right? But like, if you're going to tell me that you can only train 2 to 3 times a week, I'll be like, yeah, you're probably going to struggle quite a bit to be able to excel in. But if you're, let's say you have a lifestyle where you can train quite a bit, yeah, I think you can actually improve in both. Will you be able to master both? Probably not. Like, you're obviously going to be able to do better if you just put all your eggs in one basket, right? But it doesn't mean that you can't make progress in both. So if by excel you mean progress, then sure, you can make progress in both. What's your view on drug-tested versus enhanced federations in different sports? Honestly, I've not thought much on this one. I have my own personal values on this, so I'm going to sort of project my personal values on this one. I think sport should generally be. I can see why they exist. From a pragmatic point of view, there are people that are going to want to see that. And should people be stopped from, taking PEDs and enhanced federations? Probably not. But I do think that from a societal standpoint, I think sport, one of the things that I think sport should do, among many other things from a societal level, is that I think sport should promote a healthy and fit lifestyle. I think it should inspire the population to be healthy and physically fit and physically active. And so for that reason, I do think drug-free sport, I know like professional sport is never truly that drug-free, but I get that. I've seen the documentary. I still think that sports should generally be drug-free, because I think that it does inspire people. I think it does inspire individuals, and I think from a societal standpoint, I'm generally against enhanced federations. So that's what I would say on that matter. How to best progress on squats when stagnating? So I would generally, without having anything to actually look at, things I would look at is, or I would actually look at the programming as well as your technique. Are there any aspects in your squat technique that is a bit inefficient? Because if we can improve your efficiency with your squat, then we can improve your work capacity and trainability of your squat. So for example, I'll give you a good example. If you're someone who doesn't balance well, then you're going to waste a lot of energy focusing on bringing your center of gravity back to midfoot, right? But if you are able to balance in your squat very well, then you're going to be able to put a lot more energy focusing on just pushing into the ground rather than just trying to balance. And that can improve, how much work you can do. Generally, I would then go through the process of analyzing the programming, looking at, the current state of your programming. I would look at the general training frequency, training levels of volume. Are you training too hard? Is there a bit of a miss and match between like primary days and secondary days? Are there any aspects in your program that, if you progress and then you sort of hit a bit of a brick wall, do you need other qualities? Have you spent a lot of time working in higher intensities? You may need to resensitize yourself to intensity work by working on slightly more volume work, right? And this is the sort of things that I might look at. Have you spent a lot of time, doing doubles and triples and quadruples, right? In which case, there may be scope for changing up the, let's say you spend a lot of time, let's say you're a very hip dominant lifter and you spend a lot of time doing very comp specific work. I may decide to get you to do a more vertical squat type variation in your training, right? So those are the sort of things that I would look at when it comes to stagnation. Can we build stuff that is sports relevant rather than sports specific? And I would look at it from that sort of angle when it comes to changing up the exercises. And sometimes it might be the case that, you need to change the order of your days around a little bit more. It might be a frequency issue. There can be loads of things, right? So it's a very difficult question to answer because I kind of have to look at the specific situation. Next question is, how do you get young stubborn lifters to move up a weight class? Quite easily nowadays, actually. I just, I made this really viral video. If you click here, you'll be able to see it. Or if I go to the description box below, you'll see it. I found that the only way that you can really convince people is to show them evidence. And so that's why I actually went out my way to find the data of, I did some original research. I looked up the heights of the top 5 lifters in the 2023 World Championships, and I sort of averaged them out and then used that to show that, at the high level, this is how tall, this is the body weight of people, this is the body weight of people at your height, right? So that's the sort of thing that I and that generally works really well. It works like magic. Literally just show them the table and they'll be like, well, I guess I'll have to move up, and because if they're stubborn, they have an idea stuck in their head, right? And when you just attack that idea with just disagreement, it's not going to convince them. They need to, the age-old phrase of seeing is believing. You kind of have to see the data, right? So that's why I made that video, so that people didn't need to argue too much about going up a weight class. At the same time, if someone is, resisting going up a weight class, it may actually, sometimes there may be an issue with body dysmorphia. So you may want to be careful with that one. Look at what their motivation for staying in their current weight class is. And that may be a sensitive topic, maybe not, but those are things that you want to take into consideration. What are your long-term ambitions for strong ambitions? I think generally I do want to get into the space of working with new coaches. I'm actually very, this is something that I've always been passionate about. When I was at UCL Barbell Club, one of the things that I did to help get people to help me manage the number of athletes was to help other people become coaches. And I really, so that's going to be a space that I'm looking to get into. So if you are keen on becoming a coach yourself, watch this space because there will be stuff for specifically your situation. And I think, generally speaking, I do want to focus on expanding my team a little bit more, but not at this point in time. So I currently have going on. So if you want to check him out, you can find his contact in the description box. Yeah, so right now, I'm just going to focus on expanding my roster a little bit more, work with potentially high level athletes, and we'll see what I bring to the table for the coaching population next year. When are we sitting down for this podcast? Soon, mate. Soon. I am currently in a position to move. I'm currently in a situation where I'll be moving homes over the next month. So we'll probably start recording the podcast next month when I settle down. If you could change one powerlifting rule, what would it be? I think I mentioned this before on my Instagram stories, but I probably would change the bench depth rule. The reason why I say that isn't from the perspective of being a coach, being a, whether it's from the perspective of a coach or athlete, is actually from a perspective of refereeing. It's actually, when you've got people who are like borderline, bench depth, it's kind of like quite hard to judge, and depending on how people sort of position their shoulders, it's very hard to judge where that specific point of the shoulder is. And one of the things that they always say when it comes to refereeing is you always have to give the athlete the benefit of the doubt. It almost practically, don't know if I should be admitting this, I almost practically see it that much when I'm refereeing. And also, another thing is like the position of your posture can influence, whether you think someone is hitting bench depth, the height of the chair that you're sitting on, how elevated the platform is. All these things can create judging bench depth so inconsistently. And I think when a rule becomes hard to judge, I think it's no longer practical viable, right? So a really good example of this is the clean and press from Olympic weightlifting, right? Like, it became so hard to judge because people used to sort of put their position, body's position in such weird ways that it was so hard to judge. So they took it out. And I think it's that. I know there's like two camps of people who are, either moan about not hitting bench depth, and then there's people who are like, oh yeah, athletes should just take responsibility. It's like, yeah, I get that taking responsibility and not moaning about the refereeing is an important thing. But I think I'm making this opinion strictly from the perspective of actually refereeing it. Do I think that it should just be taken out and that's it? Maybe, maybe not. Do I think that there is a potentially better rule that is yet to be discovered? That's kind of where my head's at. So that's my opinion on it. Most viewed video. My most viewed video is the weight class height video. And yeah, I actually am not surprised that it's my most popular video because it probably provided really important information and create the most utility for a large number of people. And so that's probably why. Favorite thing about being a coach. My favorite thing about being a coach is actually seeing personal growth when you're with someone for a long time and you watch them mature and it's become a stronger, more resilient person and more competent person. And you watch people trust the process and watch the success, watch the hard work pay off with success. That's pretty rewarding. And I think that probably applies to most coaches in any sort of field. But I think that's probably my favorite thing about being a coach. To be honest, I'm actually, do you know what? I do think I know you asked for like one favorite thing, but I'm going to throw in two favorite things. I do think game day handling is extremely satisfying, especially when you have to make calls and decisions on attempt selections and choosing the right one, so that where you take in all of this information, all of this data from what's going on with another lifter and then what's going on with a third lifter, and then you there's so much uncertainty, right? But when you make the right call and it pays off, that's extremely satisfying. So yeah. Does a powerlifting program require more rest days as opposed to a bodybuilding program? I'm not quite sure if that's what you mean. I'm going to assume that's what you mean. Not necessarily. Just because you are hitting your compound movements more with heavier weights doesn't necessarily mean you need more rest days. You need an appropriate number of rest days between lifts, but like most intermediate lifters, will happily squat twice, deadlift twice, and bench 3 to 4 times a week. What do you think about supertotal? Do you think you could be good at both powerlifting and weightlifting? So I probably won't answer the second part of the question because I answered I answered that question earlier on. But what do I think of a supertotal? I think that would be a really interesting thing to watch. I think it would create a bridge between ex-weightlifters who, potentially want to change directions and want to get into powerlifting. I think, creating a supertotal event would be a gateway like a bridge between the sports, and like it can get ex weightlifters to come and do powerlifting. I think that could be a good thing. So yeah, I do think a super total event would be useful. How do you deal with your most difficult clients to keep the relationship going? So I have stopped working with athletes in the past because the relationship just wasn't quite there, and I don't think it's necessarily anyone else's fault. Like there is a vast range of personalities within powerlifting, and I don't like to necessarily give up on someone. I'm always in a position to try and persevere and figure things out. Sometimes it's the athlete's decision, and that's fine. If it gets to the point where, I think one of the things that's really important for coaches is to know what their non-negotiables are. And if athletes refuse to meet those non-negotiables, then, and it's very clear to you, then you need to potentially suggest that they move on to a different coach. But yeah, no, normally knowing what my boundaries are, so long as they meet my boundaries, I normally try to persevere to try and improve the relationship with them. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, and that's absolutely fine. But you always learn something in the process of that.